Well, Jesus was looking for me, and finally found.
Bob Dylan has always been a mystery. For more than 6 decades, he has lived at the center of music history while managing to remain just out of reach. A poet who became a rock star, a folk hero who rejected labels, a Nobel Prize-winning songwriter who still insists he's just a troubadour. His words have shaped generations, inspiring movements and giving voice to the restless spirit of rebellion. Yet through it all, Dylan has remained notoriously private, rarely revealing much about his personal tastes or private opinions. Fans have long wondered, who inspired Bob Dylan? What bands did he admire, respect, and keep close to his heart? For years, Dylan gave cryptic interviews, dodged direct questions, and kept his cards close to his chest. But now, at 84, the legend has finally spoken clearly about the 5 bands he considers his personal favorites. And his choices may surprise you. From iconic pioneers who redefined rock, to groundbreaking groups that challenged tradition, to unexpected names that shaped Dylan's view of artistry. His list reflects not just admiration, but also his philosophy on what music should be: authentic, uncompromising, and timeless. These aren't just random picks. They are the bands that Dylan believes truly changed the landscape of modern music. And in typical Dylan fashion, his reasons are deeply thoughtful, occasionally blunt and entirely his own. Today, we uncover the 5 bands Bob Dylan finally named as his all-time favorites and explore why each of them left such a lasting impact on one of the greatest songwriters the world has ever known. When Bob Dylan finally revealed his list of favorite bands, it came as no surprise that the Beatles were among them. But what made Dylan's admiration fascinating was not just the acknowledgement itself, but the way he described their influence. For Dylan, the Beatles were not merely a pop sensation. They were musical revolutionaries who redefined what a band could achieve. Dylan first met the Beatles in 1964, at the height of Beatlemania. The band was already sweeping the world with their charming harmonies and catchy melodies, but Dylan saw something deeper beneath the surface. Unlike many of their early critics who dismissed them as a teenage fad, Dylan recognized that Lennon and McCartney had a rare gift for melody and lyricism. According to those who were there, Dylan introduced the Beatles to a more introspective style of songwriting, pushing them toward deeper lyrics, while in turn, they opened his eyes to the possibilities of modern rock. It was an exchange that would forever alter music history. Dylan's folk roots and poetic sensibility began to bleed into the Beatles' work, inspiring classics like Norwegian Wood and A Day in the Life. Meanwhile, Dylan absorbed the band's fearless experimentation, which encouraged him to plug in an electric guitar and defy the expectations of his own folk audience. For Dylan, the Beatles represented artistic courage. He admired how they continually reinvented themselves, refusing to remain trapped in the formula that made them famous. From the innocence of Please Please Me to the psychedelic journey of Sgt. Pepper's Lonely Hearts Club Band and the raw honesty of the White Album, Dylan saw the Beatles as a band that never settled for mediocrity. He also praised their willingness to blur the lines between commercial appeal and artistic depth. While other bands chased trends, the Beatles created them, managing to dominate radio airwaves while still producing songs that carried weight, wit, and experimentation. To Dylan, this balancing act was not only rare, it was genius. In interviews later in life, Dylan reflected on their impact with a mixture of admiration and awe. They were doing things nobody else was doing, he said. The way they changed everything, you can't even measure it. To him, the Beatles weren't just another successful band. They were a cultural force that shifted the very axis of popular music. But perhaps the most personal reason Dylan loved the Beatles was the way their music never lost its sense of joy. Even as they grew darker and more complex, there was always a spark of playfulness, a reminder that music could be both profound and fun. Dylan, whose own work often carried a heavy poetic weight, appreciated that balance. In naming the Beatles as one of his all-time favorites, Dylan was acknowledging not only their influence on the world, but also their influence on himself. The mutual inspiration between Dylan and the Beatles created some of the greatest music of the 20th century, a dialogue between two forces that refused to play it safe. For Dylan, the Beatles weren't just another band. They were proof that music could be endlessly inventive, fearless, and transformative. And even at 84, he still looked back on them not as rivals, but as kindred spirits who shaped his journey. If the Beatles represented artistic reinvention and melodic brilliance, then for Bob Dylan, the Rolling Stones embodied raw energy, defiance, and swagger. When Dylan finally admitted that the Stones had earned a place among his favorite bands, it was a nod not only to their longevity, but to their unapologetic attitude toward rock and roll itself. Dylan first crossed paths with the Rolling Stones in the mid-1960s, when both were becoming seismic forces in popular music. The Beatles may have reshaped the pop landscape, but the Stones injected something darker, a gritty, rebellious edge that Dylan immediately recognized. Where Lennon and McCartney leaned toward poetic introspection, Mick Jagger and Keith Richards tapped into primal instincts, pushing boundaries with their unapologetic lyrics and blues-driven sound. What Dylan admired most was their authenticity. The Stones never pretended to be anything other than who they were. They embraced the blues roots of American music and filtered them through a raw, raucous energy that connected with people on a visceral level. For Dylan, who had himself faced criticism when he went electric at the Newport Folk Festival, the Stones' refusal to bow to expectations felt like a kindred spirit. Songs like Paint It Black, Gimme Shelter, and Sympathy for the Devil carried a darkness that mainstream audiences had rarely encountered before in rock. Yet Dylan respected how the Stones made such bold music not only popular but timeless. They weren't writing songs to please anyone. They were creating anthems that challenged and provoked. That courage struck a deep chord with Dylan. He also admired their sheer durability. Decade after decade, the Rolling Stones remained a touring powerhouse, continuing to fill stadiums long after many of their contemporaries had faded into nostalgia acts. For Dylan, who himself spent years on his so-called never-ending tour, this relentless dedication to live performance was more than just impressive. It was proof of their commitment to music as a way of life. Dylan often spoke of music as something sacred, a language of truth that transcended fame or fortune. In the Rolling Stones, he saw a band that lived by a similar creed. No matter how much criticism they endured, whether for their bad boy image, controversies, or wild lifestyles, they never stopped being the Rolling Stones. They didn't compromise. They didn't conform. They just kept playing. On a personal level, Dylan had moments of playful rivalry with the group. He once joked that the Stones were a blues cover band, but it was said with affection, not malice. Behind the teasing was an acknowledgement of their greatness. After all, Dylan himself had drawn deeply from blues traditions, and he recognized how the Stones had carried that torch into the rock era with unrelenting passion. The Stones' catalog also contained a kind of survivalist spirit that Dylan admired. Through the chaos of fame, drugs, scandals, and even deaths, they endured. Songs like You Can't Always Get What You Want revealed a philosophical streak beneath their rebellious exterior, something Dylan, ever the poet, could relate to. When asked later in life about the Rolling Stones, Dylan didn't mince words. "They're the greatest rock and roll band in the world," he said. That statement alone cemented their place in his list of favorites. To Dylan, the Stones were more than a band. They were an institution, a reminder of what rock and roll was meant to be: dangerous, untamed, and alive. By placing them alongside the Beatles, Dylan was acknowledging both sides of rock's evolution. The Beatles elevated the art form. The Stones kept it grounded in grit and rebellion. Together they formed the dual heartbeat of a generation. And Dylan, ever the student and master of music, recognized both as essential. If there was ever a group that earned Bob Dylan's unwavering respect, it was the band. Unlike the Beatles or the Rolling Stones, the band's relationship with Dylan wasn't just one of admiration from afar. It was deeply personal, collaborative, and life-changing for both sides. To Dylan, the band wasn't simply another great rock group. They were family, confidants, and fellow travelers on the unpredictable road of music. The story began in the mid-1960s, when Dylan faced one of the most controversial decisions of his career, going electric. At a time when the folk community expected him to remain the voice of protest songs and acoustic ballads, Dylan shocked audiences with amplified guitars and rock rhythms. Many booed. Critics sneered. His once loyal fans accused him of betrayal, but Dylan refused to turn back. To bring this new sound to life on stage, he needed a backing group capable of matching his vision. That group was the Hawks, a Canadian-American bar band led by Ronnie Hawkins. Soon after, they would become known simply as the band. With Robbie Robertson on guitar, Levon Helm on drums, Rick Danko on bass, Richard Manuel on piano, and Garth Hudson on keyboards, they weren't just competent musicians. They were extraordinary. Each member had a unique voice, and together they created a sound that was both tight and soulful, blending rock, folk, blues, and country into something completely new. When Dylan and the band toured together in 1966, the reaction was explosive, literally. Audiences around the world booed, jeered, and shouted "Judas" at Dylan, but the band never flinched. They stood by him, night after night, delivering performances that were raw, fearless, and defiant. For Dylan, their loyalty and talent proved invaluable. Where others abandoned him, the band became his anchor. Their collaboration reached a peak during the famous sessions at a pink house in Woodstock, New York, later immortalized as the Basement Tapes. Those recordings captured a side of Dylan that was playful, experimental, and free. With the band, he rediscovered the joy of music making, away from the glare of critics and the pressure of the spotlight. Together, they crafted songs that felt timeless, rooted in American tradition, yet entirely fresh. Dylan later admitted that the band influenced him as much as he influenced them. Their 1968 album, Music from Big Pink, stunned the rock world with its earthy authenticity. While much of the late 60s music scene was chasing psychedelic experimentation, the band went in the opposite direction, creating stripped-down songs steeped in rural imagery and heartfelt storytelling. Dylan admired their courage to resist trends and instead craft something enduring. He often praised their ability to work as a unit. Unlike many bands dominated by a single star, the band operated like a true collective. Each member contributed equally, and their blend of voices created haunting harmonies that Dylan considered unmatched. For a man who valued words above all, Dylan recognized that the band's strength wasn't just in lyrics or melodies. It was in the chemistry of 5 musicians playing as one. Their relationship wasn't without tension, but the respect remained. When Dylan took the stage for The Last Waltz in 1976, the band's legendary farewell concert filmed by Martin Scorsese, it was more than just a guest appearance. It was a tribute to the brothers in arms who had carried him through some of the most turbulent years of his career. For Dylan, the band represented more than music. They symbolized resilience, creativity, and loyalty. They proved that art could thrive in the face of rejection, and that true collaboration could elevate everyone involved. By naming them among his 5 favorite bands, Dylan wasn't simply honoring their music. He was acknowledging the bond that had shaped his own journey. If Bob Dylan's admiration for the Beatles was about innovation, and his love for the band was about loyalty and collaboration, then his respect for the Rolling Stones was rooted in endurance and raw authenticity. Few groups could stand shoulder to shoulder with Dylan when it came to longevity, but the Stones have managed it, not just surviving the decades, but dominating them. To Dylan, that was nothing short of remarkable. When the Stones first burst onto the scene in the early 1960s, they were labeled the dangerous counterpoint to the clean-cut Beatles. With their scruffy hair, blues-inspired riffs, and rebellious swagger, they became the bad boys of rock and roll. While Dylan was carving his reputation as the sharp-tongued poet of the folk world, the Stones were defining what it meant to be provocative, electrifying performers. It wasn't long before their paths crossed, and Dylan was watching closely. What impressed Dylan most wasn't just their music, though it was groundbreaking in its own right. It was their ability to channel the roots of American blues and R&B into something global. Songs like Satisfaction and Jumpin' Jack Flash weren't just hits. They were cultural earthquakes. Dylan, who had always been deeply connected to the American musical tradition, admired how the Stones took those same influences and infused them with a swagger that turned them into stadium anthems. There was also an undeniable mutual respect. Keith Richards, the Stones' guitarist, has often spoken highly of Dylan's songwriting, even calling him the greatest lyricist of all time. Mick Jagger, too, acknowledged Dylan's influence, especially in pushing the boundaries of what rock lyrics could achieve. Dylan, in turn, respected that the Stones didn't try to imitate him. They found their own lane, and they owned it. Dylan once commented that the Stones were the greatest rock and roll band in the world, a title they wore with pride. He admired their staying power, their refusal to bow out gracefully, and their ability to keep evolving without losing their core identity. For Dylan, who himself has reinvented his sound countless times, that kind of adaptability was essential for survival in an unforgiving industry. But Dylan also saw something deeper in the Stones. He recognized that behind the spectacle, the massive tours, the wild headlines, the hedonistic lifestyle, there was an unshakable dedication to the music itself. Richard's obsession with riffs, Charlie Watts's steady drumming, and Jagger's restless energy all spoke to a commitment that Dylan understood. These weren't just entertainers, they were craftsmen, living and breathing rock and roll. Their connection went beyond admiration. Dylan occasionally joined the Stones on stage, and they shared the same circles of influence, from blues legends like Muddy Waters to contemporary peers like Jimi Hendrix. In many ways, they were kindred spirits, artists who refused to let age, criticism, or even personal turmoil derail their pursuit of music. By naming the Rolling Stones as one of his 5 favorite bands, Dylan wasn't just tipping his hat to a group of contemporaries. He was acknowledging a band that embodied resilience and authenticity, traits he valued above all else. The Stones, much like Dylan himself, weren't about perfection. They were about energy, defiance, and passion. And in Dylan's eyes, that was what rock and roll was truly meant to be.